Hi, I'm Chris Yukins. I'm a professor at George Washington University Law School, and welcome to this Module 2 in the series United Nations Guidance on Anti-Corruption and Procurement. In this second module, we'll be discussing concepts and definitions having to do with anti-corruption efforts in procurement. Let's take a moment to talk about the definition of corruption. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, defines it as the abuse of a public or private office for personal gain. The World Bank defines it as the abuse of public office for private gain. And Transparency International says it's the misuse of entrusted power for private gain, that corruption hurts everyone who depends on the integrity of people in a position of authority. See the common theme here, which is that corruption is broadly understood to mean misuse of public power, but there are forms of corruption, such as bitter collusion, that can also badly hurt a procurement system. So one of the themes that we'll be returning to again and again over these lessons is that corruption really is an undermining of the procurement system. It can be in the form of misuse of public power, or it could be even private action, as in bitter collusion. The core issue is that corruption can undermine the goal, the core goal of any procurement system, which is, again, to achieve best value in purchasing goods and services for the public use. The UN Convention Against Corruption and the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention do not define corruption, but they establish various forms of corrupt offenses. That's how they frame off what corruption is. Again, these offenses can include bribery, extortion, collusion, fraud, embezzlement, misappropriation, or other diversions of property by a public official, or abuse of a function, or illicit enrichment, or other offenses. We'll be talking about those over the subsequent slides. Let's talk for a few minutes about key elements in every corruptive behavior. This is laid out by the late criminologist Donald Cressy. He talked about three key elements in every corrupt behavior: the pressure, the motivation, such as financial need or emotional need, or need for job performance reasons to engage in corruption. Opportunity, there's an ineffective lack of controls or insufficient monitoring. And rationalization, such as it's only a small amount, or everybody does it, it's just this once. These are the three things that come together: the pressure, motivation, opportunity, and rationalization, that are likely to lead to corruptive behavior. It's worthwhile stressing in the procurement context that a lot of the controls we'll be talking about are in fact controls for ensuring adequate monitoring or for sanctioning inappropriate behavior. So it creates a counter pressure. For example, while a procurement official may feel a financial need or a social need to engage in corruption, for example, I need to accept bribes so I can give money to my church, something you'll sometimes hear from the corrupt officials trying to rationalize their behavior. So the controls are counter pressures, and the monitoring is an attempt to reduce the opportunity. That leaves the rationalization, and the rationalization is something that's important for you to be able to address as a procurement official, as somebody who is in an important management role in a public function. What needs to be delivered over and over is the message that no, it's not a small amount. We're talking oftentimes about public funds, and this doesn't matter the amount. It's important. There's a legitimacy, or there's an importance that attaches to no matter how large an amount of money we're talking about. It's not just this once, because once you start doing it, you really can't stop. And there's no rationale that everybody does it or that you deserve it. That's just not appropriate. So it's very important as an actor in the procurement regime, an official or a contractor, for example, or a lawyer or an investigator, that you be very clear that there is no rationalization for corruption in public procurement, because the stakes are just too high, as we'll be discussing over the course of these modules. So we're going to survey here a few different types of corruption. I'm going to be looking at bribery, which is typically something given to a public official in return for an improper action on part of the public official. We're going to be talking about fraud, which is typically arises in malperformance by a contractor. So it presents a performance risk for the government if the contractor isn't performing as it's required to. Extortion is when a person, perhaps a private official, demands something of a public official, or demands, for example, that the public official grant a contract under threat of, let's say, physical violence. An abusive function is when a public official misuses her authority in accomplishing some act. Illicit enrichment is when a public official is, for example, gathering monies from bribes or other revenues that are flowing from a public project, illicitly gathering that in illicit enrichment. And the last is collusion. That's typically when bidders are acting in collusion in order to drive up the price of a public contract. Speak for a moment about one of the main types of corruption, which is bribery. Transparency International defines bribery as the offer or receipt of any gift, loan, fee, reward, or other advantage, really, and it can be any advantage. It could be something, for example, as simple as a pizza or a jacket, to or from any person as an inducement to do something that is dishonest, illegal, or a breach of trust in the conduct of the enterprise's business. What this very broad definition from Transparency International is hinting at, that while we normally think of bribery in the public context, a public official accepting a bribe for an illicit public act, in fact, you can have private bribery, a bribe between two private individuals as well, as we'll be discussing in a few minutes. Bribery is typically a criminal offense for individuals or natural persons in most jurisdictions. In many jurisdictions now as well, bribery can be a criminal offense for which a corporation is held liable as well. An example of a bribe would be a procurement official receives $20,000 not to publicly tender a contract and directly award it to a certain company. That is the kind of bribery that we might commonly see in a public. Now, one type of bribe that we see in public procurement is a kickback. And kickback is giving or receiving anything of value to influence a business decision, typically an award of a contract. Kickbacks can appear in any stage of the procurement process, but there's frequently a kickback after contract award. So, for example, a subcontractor that would otherwise be inferior and wouldn't get a subcontract on a public contract would offer a bribe to the prime contractor in return for the prime contractor giving a subcontractor a subcontract award. After the prime contract is awarded, the work begins. The subcontractor will then give the prime contractor a share of its revenues, a kickback, in return for the award of the subcontract. A kickback is a form of bribery. It's typically referred to as commercial bribery. And it's frequently undisclosed payments in return, again, for favorable treatment. It can come in the form of a personal loan. It can come in the transfer of property or vehicles, come in lavish vacations, it can come in school fees. There are many different ways by which one private party, typically a company, would give some money or some benefit to another private company in the supply chain in return for favorable treatment, either in the award of a prime contract or a subcontract. These kickbacks are serious because they typically lead to inflated prices for the public customer. The government that's using these contractors and subcontractors will typically end up paying more, and will end up paying more for inferior goods and services. So kickbacks are treated very seriously, although it's a commercial bribe running between two private parties, because it can have a public impact, because it can result in higher prices and inferior quality. Governments will focus enforcement attention in trying to block this type of commercial bribery or kickbacks, as well as normal bribery that we're used to. Let's talk about fraud for a second. Another type of the corruption that we're analyzing here. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the EBRD, defines a fraudulent practice as any action or omission, including misrepresentation, that knowingly or recklessly misleads or attempts to mislead a party to obtain a financial benefit or to avoid an obligation. There's a couple of things that's worthwhile picking out here. So usually it requires an intentional act or an intentional omission in order to constitute a criminal fraud. But it's worthwhile pointing out that in the United States, for example, under the Civil False Claims Act, the False Claims Act imposes very severe penalties on a civil basis for reckless action. And a reckless fraud is one where there's gross negligence. And some people would define that to mean gross negligence proceeding in the face of a known risk. So if, for example, under the U.S. fraud statute, if a contractor proceeds even though the corporation's management knows that the item that's being delivered may be defective, it's possible that they would be found liable for acting recklessly, and that they'd be liable for civil fraud penalties, which are, again, in the U.S. system, are very severe. It can be, again, though, a criminal offense for individuals and a criminal offense for corporations, depending if there's intentional action or not. Certainly in the U.S. system, the criminal and civil frauds can be brought in parallel, depending on the severity of the action by the contractor and by its managers. The difference between fraud and corruption is that corruption is a broad term that can be implied to fraud. But again, here with fraud, we're looking at private action. It's not a misuse of public authority. So why are we talking about private action as a form of corruption? This gets back to the point we made before, that corruption, more broadly understood, is anything that undermines the procuring system's ability to gain best value. That means in turn that anti-corruption efforts, if they're correctly drawn, anti-corruption efforts should yield best value for the system overall. Our real goal here is to use all these different anti-corruption instruments as a way of ensuring that the government, that the public procuring entity can gain best value. So an example of a false claims would be a contractor submitting a false statement regarding its previous experience to meet minimum criteria in a contract. This might be considered a form of fraud. And again, that's punished by different systems in different ways. The multilateral development banks have sanctions under which they will debar contractors for fraudulent practices. In the United States, as I mentioned, there's a mature system that's been in place since the American Civil War in the 1860s, a mature system for punishing fraud, both civilly and criminally, for perpetrating a fraud against the United States by acting recklessly, for example, or acting intentionally fraudulently. An important protection for governments to ensure that they are getting best value, to address the performance risk that would otherwise comes with fraudulent and shoddy work. Let's talk for a minute about extortion. Extortion is the unlawful use of one's position or office to obtain money through coercion or threats. The threat can involve threats of physical harm, and it's typically a criminal offense for individuals. As you try to define the difference between corruption and extortion, there's a good explanation here on the slide from the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, the OECD. The quote here is, "The solicitation of bribes is the act of asking or enticing another to commit bribery. It becomes extortion," says the OECD, "when this demand is accompanied by threats that endanger the personal integrity or the life of the private actors involved." So an example is a procurement official is told by a bidder to exclude another bidder from a tender procedure where the official's family will be attacked. You see here that there's an extension beyond a normal bribe situation to where there's actually a threat of physical harm and therefore extortion. Another form of corruption is illicit enrichment, and the UN Convention Against Corruption defines this as a significant increase in the assets of a public official that he or she cannot reasonably explain in relation to his or her lawful income. So in some ways, a official is being asked to prove a negative, that he or she hasn't engaged in corruption because there's no reasonable explanation for the growth in his or her wealth. The illicit enrichment can be a criminal offense for individuals, and many jurisdictions are going after this. It implicates a collateral issue called beneficial ownership. Or the beneficial owners, say the shareholders in a corporation. Oftentimes, an official may actually have an ownership interest in a contractor that's being enriched, and so in a probe regarding beneficial ownership, a probe to assess who really owns this contractor. If that probe reveals that the beneficial owner is in fact the official himself, that would be in a form of illicit enrichment of that official. And so it shows us the importance of being able to discern who the beneficial owners are of a contractor. That's an increasingly important issue in public policy debates, how we discern that beneficial ownership. So here's an example of illicit enrichment here on the slide. A procurement official earning US $2,000 per year per month purchased a car worth $100,000 and a new apartment worth $1 million. This type of spending by a public official who's earning a relatively small amount per month would trigger concerns regarding illicit enrichment. What about collusion? We referred to this before. Collusion is defined by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's combinations, conspiracies, or agreements among sellers to raise or fix prices and to reduce output in order to increase profits. Again, this is a form of corruption which really involves private-to-private behavior. It can be an agreement between two or more entities to limit open competition by deceiving, misleading, or defrauding or gaining an unfair advantage. This would typically be seen as cartel behavior, raising antitrust concerns, and this is usually criminal type behaviors. An example would be where bidders A, B, and C, the only three bidders that are pre-qualified, agree that bidder B will not submit a bid, and that bidder A will offer a price of X, and bidder C will offer a higher price, and therefore lose it if this is a price-based competition. So this is an example. The example here is an example of how in the real world collusion might work. So to understand how corruption can occur in public procurement, it's important, of course, to understand the purpose of public procurement. It's to obtain the best value. At its core, it's to obtain the best value for money at a reduced cost, if at all possible. To obtain goods, works, or services in the correct quality and quantity from the best supplier under appropriate contractual terms and conditions. That's the core purpose of public procurement, and that's where we're most likely to see corruption. But it's important to understand that there are ancillary purposes of public procurement that may be implicated as well. So, for example, public procurement is oftentimes used to stimulate innovation, and that's an area where corruption can arise. Public procurement also can be used to support social and environmental policy, or, for example, to support SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. So when you have these ancillary goals, when these ancillary goals are built into the procurement system, there's a broader array of areas in which corruption can arise. Public procurement is frequently related to high value and complex procurements. This is especially the case, for example, with complex construction or complex works, or complex information technology, or even a complex weapon system. Public procurement can implicate very high value projects that are very complex. The size, cost, nature, and complexity are often different from those in private procurements. And the more complex the procurement is, the more difficult it is to monitor because of the technical nature of the process, and just the back and forth in negotiations, for example, may be very difficult to monitor for an outsider because of the needs to protect proprietary information on the part of the contractor. There are going to be time and staff constraints that make it more difficult to monitor, more difficult to ensure that corruption isn't occurring. So with more complex procurements, we're likely to see an increased risk of corruption, which is one of the reasons why an effective anti-corruption system is so important. I'm going to flip that on its head. Many of the things that a government buys are bought through very, very complex procurements, necessarily complex procurements. If the government's going to get the best value, it has to embrace the complexity, because some complexity really reflects the complexity typically of the technology being purchased. If there's not an effective anti-corruption system in place, which will allow the government to embrace that complexity, to take the risk, the transaction risk that the complexity presents. If there's not an effective anti-corruption system in place, the government, in essence, will have to dumb down the procurement and won't be able to buy as sophisticated technology, which can have very significant impacts. For example, if you're talking about a health system, an IT system that's being bought for health services. If the health services IT system has to be dumbed down, has to be simplified in order to accommodate a system that can't bear corruption risk, then the health and welfare of the public patients, of the persons actually using that public health system, will be hurt. A good example there of the need to have, as procurement systems grow more complex and buy more complex things, the need to have ever more effective anti-corruption systems in place. So to put the risk of corruption into context, you need to get an idea of the size of these public procurement markets. Public procurement markets typically account for the largest share of public expenditures in any given country. That give you an idea of the size of the public procurement markets. Governments typically spend around 15 to 30% of GDP, the gross domestic product, for public procurements. In the EU market, it's around 15% of the gross domestic product. In the U.S. federal market, the U.S. federal market is smaller. It's only about 3% of the GDP of the United States, but that's still $500 billion, $500 billion per year. UNOPS, even UNOPS spends around $1 billion per year on procurement, a substantial amount that it can affect, that really has worldwide impact. Government and donors, it's important to stress, are spending taxpayers' money, and that implicates issues of legitimacy in the system. So there are processes and protections that have to be built into the system that a private procuring entity, let's say a private company, wouldn't have to have in place, because the governments need to preserve the legitimacy of the process because of their taxpayer stakeholders. Public procurement has often been identified as the most corruption-prone area for many countries. That's partly because, again, the size of public procurement in many countries, and because of the opportunity it presents for corruption for officials who want to take some share of the country's wealth. So as we've been discussing over the previous slides, there are at least 3 different types of impacts from corruption in public procurement. There's a fiduciary risk that that money that has been entrusted by the public to a given official will be misspent, will be misdirected. That's a fiduciary risk. There's a reputational risk to the government, that corruption undermines the reputation of the government. And finally, there's a performance risk. There's a risk that because of corruption, the performances required by the government won't be achieved, that a defective product, for example, will be delivered. Now, we can see how this plays out in particular contexts. For example, in the financial impact from corruption, up to 20 to 25% of the contract's value in some countries may be lost to corruption, or the giver of a bribe in a public procurement process can see the bribe as a cost of business, and therefore is a reason not to invest in a country because of the cost of giving bribes. So the investor, the prospective investor or contractor, may say, look, I don't want to go to this country and invest because I'm going to have to pay an additional amount in bribes. There can be a waste of money for repairs or purchases that were not needed, and this causes a broader disadvantage because very precious resources are being diverted. There can be an impact on health and safety if substandard products are being delivered. There can be accidents due to substandard construction, and no funds might be available for other important purposes such as healthcare. There can be an impact on the trust in government. This is the reputational risk. Corruption serves as a role model for other officials and companies, and if there's pervasive corruption coming from the procurement sphere, that can taint other parts of the government as well. Corruption will erode the trust in the government and its political elite, and questionable usefulness of goods being purchased, there have been cost overruns, delays in implementation, etc. All of these things undermine the public trust in the government. This is the reputational risk that we spoke about before. There can be an impact on innovation. It can be that not the best company, but the most corrupt company, the company that offers the biggest bribe, is winning the public contracts. And as a result, innovative companies can be discouraged from participating in public tenders. This, in essence, the corruption becomes a buffer or a barrier between the engines of innovation, which are oftentimes small and medium-sized enterprises or new entrants in a marketplace. They may decide not to participate in the public procurement markets, and that can slow down innovation over society as a whole. Finally, corruption can have an environmental impact. There can be environmental impact from unnecessary infrastructure, for example, infrastructure that's undertaken simply in order to win a bribe. Or it might be that because of bribery or other forms of corruption, environmental minimum standards are not observed in order to maximize profit. Here again, corruption can have a severe impact on the environment of the purchasing nation. In a moment, we'll talk about different corruption risks in different countries, but for now, I just want to pause just for a second and note that there are also different levels of risks within countries in different industries. So for example, the defense sector may be particularly vulnerable in one country, or the extractive industries or the oil and gas industries may be very vulnerable to corruption in other industries. It really varies from country to country and from industry to industry. And this matters because not only enforcement officials, but importantly, corporations working in these sectors, if they have a contractual or a statutory obligation, or generally as a matter of good prudence corporate behavior, if they're setting up a compliance system, the compliance system needs to be adjusted to the level of corruption risk that's presented. And if a company is entering a particularly corrupt industry or a particularly corrupt country, we'll talk about that in a second, the company may well want to put up a different and stronger compliance system. The ways that the corruption can vary from country to country are extraordinary. So, for example, in some countries, bribes are set as a percentage of the contract volume of the total contract amount. In some countries, it's a regular practice for political parties to expect that they will be able to receive a percentage of the contracts let by the ruling party, that the ruling party will be able to take money from that, to take bribes directly from the contracts that are being let. So it's an extraordinary diversity of corruption, and as a result, that means there has to be real diversity in anti-corruption systems on the corporate side, on the vendor side, certainly in different compliance systems. So this is another measure of how corruption risk can be measured for purposes of setting up a compliance system. The Transparency International Corruption Perception Index is just that. It's an assessment of the perception of actors or participants, stakeholders in a given country, some of them foreign, some of them domestic, what their perception is of the corruption levels in that country. It's an attempt by Transparency International to give an accurate assessment of the perception, but in fact it is just a perception index. And it's not necessarily as objective as other measures. For example, how many bribery convictions are there in a given country? What's important to stress here is that this is just one of the points of data used by companies when they're assessing what kind of compliance system to put in place. This is a measure of the risk, the overall risk of corruption in the country, and then that risk is likely to be broken down by sector, for example, pharmaceuticals or extractive industries, and then to be broken down by the type of work that the company is doing. If the company, for example, is participating in the more complex contracting, there's likely to be a higher risk of corruption. If it's engaged only in sealed bidding, in low price traditional bidding, then there's going to be probably less risk of corruption. So this is a variegated analysis that a company has to undertake in setting up a compliance system. Data like this is incredibly important because it helps shape that analysis. It helps determine whether or not the company is taking reasonable measures in trying to stop corruption in its own ranks. I want to close out this module by recommending to you an additional reading, additional resource. It's the Corruption Perceptions Index from Transparency International. It's a good resource to become comfortable with so that you understand how the Transparency International derives its Corruption Perceptions Index, because that's an important component, as we've been discussing over the past few minutes. That's an important starting point for understanding what levels of corruption are relevant in any given country, especially, for example, as a multinational begins to put together a transnational compliance effort, a transnational strategy for dealing with corruption in different countries in which it's doing business. So again, I recommend this resource to you. This closes out this module on concepts and definitions. Again, I look forward to seeing you in the next module, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.